Good morning, dear students. We continue our lectures from normal anatomy. Today's will be next topic about articulation. So, our topic is general arthrology, classification of joints, structure and function of the joints. Arthrology is a scientific study of joints and articulations. Classification of joints. Subdivide into two big groups. Classification based on structure and classification based on function. All bone articulations can be divided into two large groups, continuous and discontinuous articulations. Continuous articulations are characterized by the presence of an uninterrupted articulating tissue, connective, cartilaginous, or osseous. Discontinuous synovial articulations contain a cavity lined with a synovial membrane. They possess a great mobility. They call joints. Intermediate forms between the continuous and discontinuous articulations are symphysis or hemiarthrosis. Continuous bone articulations. Fibrous articulations, Latin Unitura fibrosa, are formed from the fibrous connective tissue and are divided into the following groups. Syndesmosis, the most common type of fibrous articulations, which includes ligaments and interosseous membranes. Sutures, sutura, fibrous articulation between the bones of the skull, which contain a thin layer of connective tissue. Symphysis, fibrous articulation between the periodontium of alveolar bone and the root of the tooth. Syndesmosis, when two bones bound by ligaments or interosseous membrane. Most movable of fibrous joints. Interosseous membrane unit radius to ulna and tibia to fibula. In the picture you can see syndesmosis between tibia and fibula. Suture, suture. Immovable fibrous joints bind skull bones together. So, all sutures subdivide into sutura serrata, sutura squamosa, and sutura plana. Serrate suture, lap suture, and plain suture. Sutura plana straight, non-overlapping edges. Palatal process of the maxilla. Serrate suture, sutura serrata. Subdivide into sutura coronalis, sutura sagittalis, and sutura lambdoidea. Sutura coronalis are located between frontal bone and parietal bone. Sutura sagittalis are located between parietal bones. Sutura lambdoidea are located between parietal bone and occipital bone. Sutura squamosa. We have between temporal bone and parietal bone. Sutura plana between the fascial bones. In the picture, you can see a lot of types of the sutures. Serrate, lap, and plain suture. Next type is symphysis, attachment of a tooth to its socket, held in place by fibrous periodontal ligament. Collagen fibers attach tooth to jawbone to a movement while chewing. Cartilaginous articulations, synchondrosis. Bones are joined by hyaline cartilage. Rib attachment to sternum. Epiphyseal plate in children binds epiphysis and diaphysis. Synchondrosis. Synchondrosis between fast rib and sternum. Synchondrosis between epiphyseal and diaphysis. Cartilaginous articulations subdivide into two types: temporal synchondrosis and permanent synchondrosis. Temporal synchondrosis are located between the sacral vertebra, between epiphysis and diaphysis of long tubular bones. Permanent synchondrosis are located between body of the vertebra and between the first rib and the sternum. Symphysis is cartilaginous bone articulation which contains a cleft-like cavity without synovial membrane. Symphysis, two bones joined by fibrocartilage. Previous symphysis. Only slight amount of movement is possible. Symphysis. Osseous articulation, Synostosis. Gap between two bones or surface. Frontal and mandibular bones in infants. Cranial suture in elderly. Attachment of first rib and sternum. Can occur as a fibrous or cartilaginous joint. Synovial joint. Joint in which two bones are separated by a space, cavity, most are freely movable. Synovial joint. Joint cavity. We have a lot of joints inside human body. Hip joint, elbow joint, wrist joint, knee joint, shoulder joint, and other. Each joint possesses four basic elements: articular cartilage, cartilago articularis, cover articular surface, articular capsule, capsula articularis, like a cup surrounds the articular ends of the bone. Articular cavity, cavitas articularis, hermetically sealed, cleft-like cavity between the articulating bones. Synovial fluid, synovia, with articular cavity. In the picture, you can see X-ray of the joint, where articular surface of the bones are covered with hyaline cartilage, which is 2.5 millimeters. The capsule of the joint attached to the edges of articular surface or somewhat over them. The articular capsule hermetically seals the articular cavity and consists of two layers: external fibrous layer, membrana fibrosa, and internal synovial layer, membrana synovialis. Synovial cavity. Synovial cavity. Under normal circumstances, the synovial cavity is a thin cleft bounded by the synovial membrane and the articular surface. Synovial fluid. In the articular cavity, there is a small amount of pale, thick synovial fluid. It is produced by synovial membrane. The synovial fluid lubricates the articular surface and reduces friction between them. Accessory structure of joints. Synovial joints may possess several accessory elements, which facilitate movement to a certain extent. Articular disc, discus articularis, a cartilaginous plate, which completely separates the joint into two regions. Articular meniscus, meniscus articularis, cartilaginous seminal plate, which partially separates the synovial cavity. articular lip, labrum articularis, cartilaginous lip, which depends the articular socket, interarticular ligaments, ligamentum interarticularis, connect bones within the joint. They are covered with a synovial membrane. Factors which aid in the stabilization of articular surface. The fibrous capsule, which is reinforced by the ligaments. Muscles, which surround the joint and actively hold the bones together due to a constant muscle tone. Molecular attraction of articular surface, lubricated by the synovial fluid. Movements in the joints. The frontal axis runs through the joint from right to left. Flexion, flexure, and extension, extensor, of the shoulder occur around the frontal axis. The sagittal axis is drawn from frontal to back. Abduction, abductor, and adduction, adductor of the shoulder occur around the axis. The vertical axis runs through the joint and through the entire arm from the top to the bottom. Medial and lateral rotations, rotatio, of the humerus occur around this axis. Circumduction, circumductor, takes place when the movement passes from one axis to another, as when the hand moves in a circular path. Circular movements are possible in multi-axial and bi-axial joints. Classification of joints. Classification of the joints based on the number of articulating surfaces. Simple is composed of only two articulating surfaces. Compound contains more than two articulating surfaces. Complex joint, if a joint contains articular disc or meniscus, which divide it into two parts. Combined joints, when two isolate joints in which movements occur simultaneously. Classification of the joints based on the shape of articulating surface. Uni-axial joints, bi-axial joints, multi-axial joints. Uni-axial joints. In these joints, movement is retracted to a single axis. There are two types of uni-axial joints. Hinge joint, ginglymus, contains articulating surface which resemble hinges, for example, interphalangeal joint of the hand and foot. Pivot joint, articulatio trachoidea or articulatio cylindrica. A cylindrical joint formed by the convex and concave articulating surface cylindrical in shape. For example, proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints. Bi-axial joints. These joints permit movements around two axes, which are perpendicular to each other. The following biaxial joints are distinguished based on their shape. Ellipsoid joint, articulatio ellipsoidea, contains elliptical H-shaped articulating surface. For example, radiocarpal joint. Bicondylar joint, articulatio bicondularis, consists of a pair of convex ellipsoid articulating surfaces which are rather prominent. Hence they are known as condylus, for example, knee joint. Saddle joint, articulatio sellaris, contains two articulating surfaces, each of which resembles a saddle. For example, carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. Multi-axial joints include spheroidal joint and their variations. Even though, in principle, movements in these joints are possible around multi-axes draw to the joint. Rotate occur only around three axes. Spheroidal joint, ball and socket joint, articulatio spheroidea, consist of a globular head and a corresponding concavity. Typical example in the shoulder joint. Variation of the ball and socket joint is a cartilage joint. Its head resides in a deep articular socket. Consequently, it is known as a cup-like joint, articulatio cotylica. Plane joint, articulatio plana, contains two flat surfaces which can be viewed at the surface of a sphere with a large diameter. Because of the small size difference of both articulating surfaces, on the slide, translations are possible in plane joints. For example, sacroiliac joint. In this picture, we have information about very important, maybe the most important joint, with name for this joint, articular surface, information about capsule, classification, accessory elements, and movements. For example, take atlanto-occipital joint. Articular surfaces are two condyles of the occipital bones and articular surface of the atlas. Both pairs of articulating surfaces are enclosed in separate capsules, moving simultaneously. Bi-axial, condylar, combined joint. Accessory elements are anterior atlanto-occipital membrane, posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, and the lateral atlanto-occipital ligament. Bending the head backward and forward, lateral bending of the head to the right and left. Look at the slide, please. You can see all information about previous joint. Occipital bone, atlas, and accessory elements. For example, anterior atlanto-occipital membrane, posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, piece of the capsule, similar scheme for temporomandibular joint. Information about articular surface, classification, accessory elements, and movements. This information is very important for practical classes. So please remember about this. Temporomandibular joint. Articular surface, accessory elements, and capsule. Shoulder joint. Also, we have all information about articular surface, about capsule, classification, accessory elements, and movements. And picture for this joint. Elbow joint with picture. Elbow joint. Wrist joint with picture. Hip joint. For example, articular symphysis. Cup-like acetabulum of the hip bone and the femoral head fitting into it, and fibrocartilaginous ring presence. Attach along the whole rim of the acetabulum and transverse ligament of the acetabulum to the femur in front along the intertrochanteric line and behind to the femoral neck parallel to the medial of the intertrochanteric crest. Classification: ball and socket-like joint, cartilage joint, and simple joint. Simple joint. Hip joint is simple joint. Ligaments: iliofemoral, pubofemoral, ischiofemoral ligaments, the orbicular zone, interarticular ligaments, the transversum acetabulum, and the ligamentum of the femur's head. Movements: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, circumflexion. Hip joint. Again, repeat this information about all joints. You will be studied during practical class. Information about knee joint with picture. In the picture you can see important accessory elements of the knee joint with lateral meniscus, medial meniscus, all ligaments, information about ankle joint with picture. Again, information about the temporomandibular joint. The temporomandibular joint, articulatio temporomandibularis, is paired and formed by the articulation of the head of the mandibular with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. It belongs to the group of the bicondylar combinate joint. The articular surfaces are incongruent. Therefore, inside the joint, there is articular disc, discus articularis, which fuses with the fibrous capsule and divides the articular cavity of the joint into two isolate levels, the upper and the lower. So, also complex joint. Fibrous capsule. In the region of the temporal bone, the capsule is attached to the margins of the mandibular fossa, or fossa mandibularis. Covers in the front the articular tubercle, tuberculum articulare, and in the back reaches the temporotympanic fissure. On the mandibular, the capsule attached to the edge of the articular surface of the head in the front, above the pterygoid fossa, while in the back, it inserts into the neck of the mandible. Ligaments. The capsule is reinforced by the lateral ligament, ligamentum laterale, whose fibers run obliquely from the zygomatic process of the temporal bone to the neck of the mandible. Importantly, the following fascious ligaments thicken in order to stabilize the mandible. Ligamentum stylomandibular, which runs from the styloid process of the temporal bone to the posterior angle of the mandible. Ligamentum sphenomandibular, which extends from the spine of the sphenoid towards the lingula of the mandible. And important movements: elevation and depression, protrusion, and lateral movements. Development of joints. Embryonic development of the joints is greatly dependent on the bone development. In these areas, the discontinuous articulations will form between the development bones. The mesenchyme is resolved in the center of the primordium, forming a cleft-like cavity of the future joint. The peripheral regions of the mesenchyme, which surround the cavity, giving rise to the fibrous capsule and ligaments of the joint. So, it was last slide for today. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.